So the news today, as far as those tuition hikes go, something we've been talking about now for weeks, is about as bad as it could get. We found out earlier today that the Quebec government let these three universities, and let's talk about McGill and Concordia because their situation is a bit different from Bishop's, and let them know that, yes, there will be increases in tuition hikes for people coming from the rest of Canada, and that 80% French equivalency, whatever you want to call it. And the university said, we can go for 40%. And the government said, sorry, no good. It's going to have to be 80% or nothing at all. Reaction from McGill was swift. There was a press conference at 1 o'clock this afternoon. In fact, if you didn't hear it, Brian, let's play at least some of this. This is Deep Saini, who was the chancellor over at McGill, reacting to that decision by the government today to go ahead and, in fact, impose these conditions. Here's what he had to say.
The measures that the government released today are devastating. They are far worse than those announced on October 13th, worse for Quebec, worse for its universities, worse for Quebec businesses who need talent, and worse for McGill. We have made thoughtful and realistic proposals to the government from the beginning of November until now, but the government has turned these against us. In the light of the damage these measures will cause, I can only view this as a targeted attack on institutions that have been part of Quebec and that have contributed to Quebec for hundreds of years. We categorically reject the position of the government. It is incoherent policy based on impressions and emotions rather than evidence-based decision-making that simply does not serve Quebec well. We will look at any and all options to ensure that McGill will continue to fulfill its mission to protect our academic excellence and to continue to serve its students from Quebec and from around the world. Thank you.
That's the reaction from McGill. Graham Carr is on the line. He's president and vice chancellor at Concordia, which finds itself in exactly the same situation. Mr. Carr, thank you for being with us. First question, your reaction to what you discovered, what you found out today.
Well, the word disappointment doesn't begin to describe it. Frankly, the announcement that was made today, after the 2 chaotic months that we've experienced, it's hugely devastating to the 3 universities, certainly to Concordia and McGill. I think we've been very clear from the outset that these policy announcements were targeting Anglophone institutions. Clearly, that's the case. It's been horrible, frankly, over the course of the last 8 weeks to go through this process, which has been devoid of any meaningful consultation, to be presented with objectives and tuition numbers, which seem to be pulled out of thin air, which don't have any basis in fact. And it's especially devastating and discouraging when the 3 Anglophone universities had not once but twice gone forward with very constructive proposals to address the government of Quebec's legitimate concerns around promotion and protection of the French language, but also to value the contribution that our institutions make to Montreal and to Quebec society.
We've been using the word nonsensical. I can't find anything in here that makes any sense whatsoever. But I guess the big question here is what happens next? Is a legal challenge on the table?
So, Natasha, the one thing that does, the one logic here is the logic that we are being set up to fail. Mm-hmm. There is nothing else in what has been proposed that makes any sense in terms of being supported by evidence, supported by data, in terms of advancing the outcomes which the government itself has identified. And those outcomes have changed, right? I mean, it's been a movable feast of rationales for the proposals that the government has put forward. Of course, we will, as McGill will, explore all options at this stage. Right now, our main priority has to be to try to communicate to those remaining prospective students from the rest of Canada and internationally who recognize the fantastic programs Concordia has to offer, who know that Montreal is a great city in which to live, and now to try to reach out to them and say, all right, here's the reality. Let's work with you to try to support your decision to come and study with us. But that task has been made massively harder than it already was, particularly because today is the 14th of December. We're well into the application season. We're now heading into the holiday season. I mean, this is essentially mission impossible for us to operationalize these changes that the government is imposing against our will today.
Can I ask, given that, what have you seen so far from students? When this first started becoming a news story, we'd heard that we were already starting to see a drop-off in applications. Can you quantify that?
Absolutely. So, and we were very clear with the minister from day one that this was going to be the outcome. And within a week, we had already seen, because it happened that a week after the announcement was originally made, we had our open house, and we saw a significant drop-off in students who had registered from the rest of Canada who simply didn't show. We now know, and the same is true as McGill, that we're seeing a 20% decline in applications from the rest of Canada, and in our case, a 30% decline in international applications. And the reason for that, of course, is because of the different versions of the announcement that the government has made up to now, and the complete chaos and confusion that it has thrown into the system.
Is there still any hope of it being deferred to 2025 instead of going into effect immediately?
We repeatedly asked for the delay. I mean, of all the requests, surely a delay was the minimum request, particularly as the days and weeks dragged on and on and on. And I would have thought, frankly, with the mounting public opinion from the Conseil de Patronat, from the Chambre de Commerce, from the Mairesse de Montréal, from a lot of influential journalists and commentators in the Francophone media, all of whom were saying, these policy proposals make no sense, and what the Anglophone universities have offered up makes sense. If none of those voices were influential, it's hard for me to know what would move the government at this point.
Yeah, to that point, I think the one thing we talked about, and it yet became even clearer today, is the fact that there has really not been what you might call a negotiation with the government, right? This kind of came out of nowhere. We heard from Pascal Derry once, and then radio silence up until this was announced.
So we heard about the original announcement at the same time as everybody else, and today we received, for the first time, a written document from the government of Quebec announcing its plans, and we received it essentially at the same time as journalists in Quebec as well. That's not a very respectful way to carry out a dialogue with institutions which have clearly manifested their desire to be partners with you, and have done so in good faith. And that's not a very respectful way, frankly, to treat world-class institutions like McGill and Concordia, whose contributions to the success of Montreal and to the rayonnement of Montreal around the world is something that nobody can contest.
Mr. Carr, I would ask you one last thing before we run out of time, and I heard McGill refer to this in their statement today as well. This idea that the government will now require 80% of students from outside Quebec studying here to reach that intermediate level of French. And I think the vice provost at McGill, Fabrice Labeau, broke it down, suggesting, while you may not think that's an awful lot, and I realize the original offer was 40% from both you and McGill, that would actually require a full additional semester for someone to actually reach that level. Is that accurate?
So it absolutely would be in some cases. It depends on the level of French that students are arriving at with that. So if we're assuming students arriving with no French, then obviously the challenge to bring them up to speed is hundreds and hundreds of hours of language training. We had set a target of 40%. 40% was ambitious, but it was something that we were comfortable with because we have expertise on teaching French as a second language, so we know a little bit about what we're doing there. Secondly, we wanted to be able to customize programs to best serve the needs of students, whether they were in business, whether they were in engineering, whether they were in the sciences, whether they were in the fine arts. And we felt we had a value proposition there to say to students, come to Concordia, come to McGill, and in addition to getting a great education, you'll have the opportunity to develop another global skill, which is acquisition of a second language. There was a very positive way to frame this, and we had set 40% as a target, but not as a ceiling. But we need to pilot that for a few years to best understand what would work. 80%, I have no idea where that figure comes from. I have no idea what that's based on. And the capacity that would demand from our organizations to be able to deliver French language programming at that scale is inconceivable in the immediate future. And it's doubly inconceivable in the context of announcements by the government that are going to dramatically reduce the revenues of the universities that are supposed to deliver those programs.
Nonsensical.
Have you, just real quick, and we have to wrap up, have you actually sat down and done a cost analysis here of how much money you're about to lose if these numbers, the 20% in admissions, actually disappear?
Well, we had done the cost analysis of the scenarios right from the very beginning, and I don't think those cost analyses are going to change very much, Aaron, because the numbers, I'm afraid, are not going to get better over the coming weeks for either Concordia or for McGill.